how do I make the decision about what style and strategy is right for me? You know, one of the things that's happened over the past number of years in the negotiation area is that folks have studied negotiations a number of different ways. They have looked at negotiation from the perspective of game theory and watching people play games. They've talked about it and looked at it from a matter of economics and economic modeling to try to figure out the rationality of the moves that are being made according to certain pricing structures and dollar values. They've also thought hard about international politics and how it is that international politics can inform the way that people negotiate and the way that they do it. And of course, cultural differences start to rise up as to how it is that negotiations may be conducted. All of these then inform style and strategy. In addition, there are ethnic differences that crop up in the literature of social science about negotiation. And finally, gender differences. Now you can combine these in a number of different ways. When you weave in social psychology, it turns out that negotiations can be thought of as basically two types. And so I'm going to suggest the answer to the question of strategy is a question that tries to incorporate all of this information into two basic approaches or strategies to negotiation. The first can be thought of as adversarial, and the second is problem solving. Let's talk about each one of these and think about what they say. An adversarial negotiator, when we watch people play games, you may think about it this way. We see people who are highly competitive. They seem to, in a sense, get themselves into an almost rage when they compete. And they are in their face and they're arguing and intimidating. You watched the other night about a hand wrestling, an arm wrestling contest where there's all this strategy of where you look into your opponent's eye or you don't look your opponent's eye. It's adversarial in the way that the game is played, the negotiation game is played. And those instincts are amazingly common and shared across negotiations. You see it in the marketplace. You see it in the marketplace, and I like to think of one of my favorite experiences of marketplace bargaining was in Beijing a number of years ago. I was standing on the street corner, and there was a lady there, and she was selling polo, what looked like polo golf shirts. And she, through a kind of a pidgin English, said, "Are you interested?" And I wasn't really interested. I was kind of wrapping up my shopping, but she said, well, nice, your size. She held up one. I said, not interested. She said, 100 won, which was about $13. And I just took a second glance, and she saw the second glance, and she said, for you, 3 shirts. 3 shirts, 100 won. I said, no, I'm not interested. She said, 5 shirts. I said, 5 shirts for $13? She says, yes. She pulls them out. They're all extra large. And they're all wrapped in plastic. They look like the polo ponies on the right side. They seem to be cotton. Who knows? I said, you know, no. She says, 7 shirts. I said, 7 shirts for 101? She says, 7 shirts. I said, I don't. She says, for you, last offer. Because the cab pulled up. She said, 10 shirts. And I said, sold. Now, they all shrunk. And they were great gifts for my kids. But what was going on there was a set of positions that were being taken in the marketplace, back and forth, to try to provoke where my interest line would be crossed. It went very, very quickly. And in some ways, when you think about any kind of bargaining in the marketplace, one side is making offers and taking positions as a substitute for a longer analysis of what the costs are and what the markup is and what the value is. And they're trying to psychologically move into a position where they're going to come together. In adversarial bargaining, the idea is that it's a zero-sum game. Really, within the bargaining range, every dollar out of one person's pocket is a dollar in the other person's pocket, and we're just trying to figure out what your bottom line is. The parties battle over fungible items set along a continuum. Compare that to a problem solver. A problem solver takes an approach which is I'm here to help solve a problem that we both have. And in that extent, the analogy is much more about a conference or a study group where we're trying to figure out how to resolve a dispute, how to handle the problem of the Palestinian-Middle East peace conflict, and we're trying to figure out how to negotiate a solution to this conflict that we're seeing people are having, and we would like to solve it in some way. To that extent, then, the bargaining in the marketplace makes some sense. Who wants it more? Who's more willing to do what it takes to get it is part of what's going on. But if, in fact, a more problem-solving approach can be achieved, if what we can do is to see that there are some shared needs and goals, then what marks this kind of strategy is we look at underlying needs of the parties, we search for solutions to satisfy essential goals of all the folks. It's not a zero-sum game. Now let's go back and explore that with one more example on each side. If you think about any kind of an employment negotiation that you're in, if you're an adversarial negotiator, you would go into the employment agreement negotiation with these steps in mind. You would probably, if you look at this chart, you'd see, you go at it, if you're the associate trying to get hired by the law firm, you'd go at it and you'd say, well, I'd like to be paid $165,000 to start. That would be wonderful. That'd be a great starting salary for me. It'd start to get me to the position I would like to be in. But you know, when I do my analysis of the market, I think that I might drive somebody away, even at King and Spalding and Alston and Bird, if I come in that high. So I'm going to come in with my opening offer, that's what OO is, opening offer, at $150,000. Now I have a target point. I've done some research and I really feel like what I'd like to do is to try to get close to what I think somebody in a big city like Atlanta is usually going to get. And so my target point may be $135,000. But you know what? If truth be told, because of the location, because of my spouse's job, I'd go as low as $105,000 because that would still take care of the costs of moving and disassociating family and all of those. And so if you really knew my inside bottom line, 105 would be my bottom line. Now you can imagine that the law firm looks at this and they'd like to pay you nothing. They might have in mind a kind of a staff attorney position that they've gotten away with, that they've offered people from time to time at $80,000 as a start. They might see whether or not they can tempt you to think of yourself that way. They may have then a target point where they're setting their budget, which is $115,000, but frankly, because of the special skills you bring, they might have, in fact, thought that they'd go to a bottom line of $130,000. You can see then how the marketplace starts to set this out. What we have is we have an overlap with that kind of a story between a bottom line of $105,000 from the perspective of the associate trying to get a job, and from the perspective of the law firm, we have a bottom line of $130,000. And within that range, it's a zero-sum game. Positions are being taken to try to substitute for a more rational analysis of what's going on. And the approach is a competitive back and forth and bluff to try to figure out where it is that people may line up. The problem solver, on the other hand, would say, well, really, what are your underlying needs and what are your underlying goals in this employment relationship? Information is going to be crucial to that about the people, about the firm's needs, about the firm's goals, about the employee and the employee's needs and goals in a fuller context. One way of getting at this is to think about the insight, the essence of the Harvard Negotiation Project and Fisher and Urey's book, Getting to Yes. Their insight and their special project is to say that very few negotiations are simply zero-sum games. That there is most often a way of thinking about negotiations as problem solving, having some aspects of problem solving in them. So what would that be and how can we explain that best? Well, the Harvard Negotiation Project talked about the negotiation of an orange, and let me talk to you about that negotiation. In it, says the Harvard folks, is the key to Middle East peace. If you think about the orange, in a kind of a mundane way, like might happen if you would walk into a grocery store and there's just one orange that would be available to be purchased. And two people come in and they come in at exactly the same time, and there's a little sign underneath the orange, and the orange says 25 cents, but there's only one orange. And if the two people get there exactly at the same time, you can imagine that the negotiation is going to be primarily about who grabs it first, or a bribe back and forth as to who wants to pay more for it. There may be a struggle. If there's just one and they both need it, and they both need it at about equal amounts, then what you have is you have a fight for the orange. But if you would ask them, what do you need the orange for? The potentials, potentially, give rise to solutions. On the one hand, if one of the people needs the orange for a rind for a cake, and the other the juice for a recipe of some sort, or a rind, excuse me, let me back up, a rind for a garnish for a drink, and the other needs the juice for the recipe for a cake. What you have is a way of splitting the orange into its parts and satisfying both people's needs. They come out splitting maybe the cost, but what you have is you have the ability, by looking at the underlying needs and goals, to get a solution to a problem that is much more contextual, takes longer to find out about, often is a substitute. The pricing negotiation is a substitute for true understanding, but you can see the benefits of a problem-solving negotiation. If then instead of the orange we think about Jerusalem, of course, what we have is the ability to look at Jerusalem in terms of shared needs in conflict, independent needs, and try to figure out whether we can look at Jerusalem and design, a gate system, a common security system, a way of thinking about where the religious sites are located to ensure access, flags that talk about feelings of ownership and possession that can be substitutes for actual ownership and possessions. And we have then a way of breaking the orange of Jerusalem out, potentially, as a way of solving the problem of Middle East peace, at least to that city. So the ideas are very interesting for negotiators who are negotiating solutions to litigation problems or business transactions, where part of what's going on are moves that are being made in a fairly competitive process. Part of what's going on is that you're looking at underlying needs and goals to be creative and expand the pie and provide solutions. My suggestion to you is that when you're thinking about strategy, you're not making a choice of either or, but you're looking for opportunities to combine strategies depending upon your client's needs, time, the amount of information that you have, and also you're looking at it in terms of the willingness of the parties to continue a relationship of some sort and working together. And that will inform your basic strategy choices, which is really the heart of the Harvard Negotiation Project.